Thank you, Gillian. Can you hear me? Not well. You can hear me now. Thank you, Gillian, for that introduction. If you believe it, you'll believe anything. It's a great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be here, to have the opportunity of seeing again colleagues and friends from earlier times, some of whom I haven't seen for a very long time, some of whom I still contrive to see fairly regularly. If you look at the program, you'll see that it's 20 minutes to 11. And coffee is going to be at 20 minutes to 12. When I was asked to give this talk, I said yes. When I was asked for a title and abstract, I had to think a little harder. It's 16 years since I finished my time as president of CercleS, 14 years since I've been at a CercleS conference, and 8 years since I retired from Trinity College, Dublin. You can't get more yesterday's man than that. And it is one of the enduring features of retirement that one's contact with the classroom recedes and recedes and recedes. Though I've been lucky because I've managed to link up with a former PhD student who's just retired as principal of a primary school in one of Dublin's western suburbs where they have the most fantastic linguistic diversity and where the teachers, following principles of learner autonomy, have managed to arrive at, I think, an innovative and certainly 100% successful solution. Anyway, having to think about what I would talk about, I looked at the title of the conference, and I looked at the themes, and I came up with the title that I came up with. Enhancing learners' creative and critical thinking, the role of university language centres. Presumably what that means is that university language centres, who are responsible above all for language teaching and learning, through that commitment accept a responsibility to develop the capacity of their students for creative and critical thinking. And the conference themes are applying research to pedagogical practice, giving learners a multicultural voice, and giving university language centres an international voice. And in one way or another, those have been the themes of every CercleS conference that there has been. Now, my underlying argument, but much of it is underlying, and you're going to have to pull it out from the implication of what I say, otherwise I'd be talking all day. First of all, the voice of university language centres will make itself heard most effectively when language centres develop a coherent research culture, preferably one that helps students to develop a capacity for creative and critical thinking in their target languages. Because if you want to count in the university world, you develop and belong to a research culture. University language learners develop a multicultural voice when the languages they learn become an integral part of their identity, capable of expressing what they are, or at any rate, part of what they are. And we're most likely to achieve both these outcomes if we adopt learning and teaching procedures that exploit learners' agency in ways that engage them as partners in research. This is how I'm going to proceed. First of all, I want to talk in an introductory way about what I take to be one of the most persistent problems in language education. Then I'm going to offer you my version of the solution to that, developing learners' second language agency and voice by promoting learner autonomy. And then, out of what I have had to say about that, I'm going to raise some questions for university language centres. There won't be time, of course, for you to offer me the answers, but you've got a handout that contains more or less all the text you're going to see on the screen, so you don't need to write anything down, though of course you may wish to make your own ribald comments on the handout as we go. And when I've raised those questions, I'll briefly recapitulate what I think I've said and its implications. First of all then, this persistent problem in language education. It's a mismatch between goals and outcomes. Now, I don't only mean there a failure of education systems to achieve the outcomes that their curricula lay claim to. It's a universal educational goal that by developing language learners' communicative repertoires, we aim to extend their identity, the scope of their agency, and the range of their voice. I take it that is what the Common European Framework of Reference's notion of a plurilingual repertoire, a plurilingual approach, is all about. That's how it's summarized. The plurilingual approach emphasizes the fact that as an individual person's experience of language in its cultural context expands, from the language of the home to that of society at large and then to the languages of other peoples, whether learnt at school or college, or by direct experience, he or she does not keep these languages and cultures in strictly separated mental compartments, but rather builds up a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes and in which languages interrelate and interact. Except that they don't. There's a widespread failure for languages that are learned formally, whether at school or college, university, to become integrated with learners' repertoires in the sense of being a part of their identity, their subjectivity, a channel for their agency and their voice. The Lucide project was funded by the European Commission from 2012 to 2014, and it brought together 18 multilingual cities, 14 of them in Europe, 13 in Europe, 4 in Canada and 1 in Australia. And the outcomes were twofold. Each city produced a report based on desk research to give some idea of what kind of a multicultural phenomenon and multilingual phenomenon it was. But also, in each city, interviews were held with various language, multilingual, language education professionals to try to build up a sense of the feel of multilingualism in different domains of those cities' lives. From those interviews, we got some very interesting results. Everyone was asked, do you consider yourself to be monolingual, bilingual, plurilingual? One of the people in Dublin interviewed said, oh, I'm monolingual with some French and Irish. Now, if you know anything about Ireland, you probably know that everybody is supposed to learn Irish from the age of 4.5 until they leave school. Nevertheless, that person was monolingual. And since she'd studied at university, she would have done French for at least 6 years. What's more, this was a person who had a professional engagement with the Irish language. The second Dublin interviewee said he was monolingual English, minimal French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, and Irish. I have 5 grown-up children who between them spent nearly 80 years failing to become communicatively proficient in Irish. It's the same in Bulgaria, though. An interviewee in Varna saw himself as monolingual, but admitted that at home he used English and Russian as well as Bulgarian, and Bulgarian and English at work. Part of an understanding of what's going on here, I think, is provided by the last of these quotations from the Oslo interviewees, who said, "I regard myself in a narrow sense monolingual because Norwegian is my language. I'm multilingual in the way that I speak and write also English, German, and some French, but it's all languages that I've learned in school. I'm not using the languages every day, and it's not part of my everyday life, except that I now have to use English a bit more. Because the definition of being bilingual is that you use 2 languages every day. I'm not bilingual in that way." Meanwhile, of course, pedagogical traditions roll on more or less unchallenged. Communicative approaches to language teaching have used much the same teaching and learning dynamic as earlier methods, since they were novelties at the end of the 70s. And in the same period, we've had successive generations of technology being mostly used in the service of these traditions. What's more, research into what they call instructed SLA tends not to question the pedagogical methods that generate the research it analyzes, and rarely, if ever, constructs a learning and teaching dynamic from first principles. Anyone in the hall who's at all familiar with my publications over the last 30 years will not be surprised to think that I think the answer to that is that we have to find ways of developing learners' agency and voice in the languages we're teaching them, and that we do that via learner autonomy. The basic claim I make is this: that the most successful language learning programs are those in which, from the very beginning, learners develop voice by channeling their agency through the target language. That means that individually and collaboratively, learners use the target language to plan, execute, monitor, and evaluate their learning. Now, that claim I can back up with evidence from various sources. There is, for example, the well-documented case of lower secondary pupils learning L2 English in Denmark, the work of Leni Dam and her former colleague Hannah Thomsen. Or there's the work I referred to in my introductory remarks, the example of primary pupils from immigrant families learning English as language of schooling. There's also the example of adult refugees learning L2 English in Ireland. And all 3 domains are in focus, talking about practical measures, but also outcomes and a research-oriented analysis of those outcomes in the book that I, with Leni Dam and Lina Legenhausen, have just submitted to Multilingual Matters. I hope still to be alive when it appears. For this purpose, I decided it would be a good idea to go for a Brechtian Verfremdungseffekt. So I'm going to talk to you about the practicality of a learner autonomy-driven learning environment in lower secondary school. And the challenge for you, which I will partly fulfill myself with the questions I'm going to pose to you, but the challenge for you is to listen to this through the prism or the lens or whatever it is of the language courses, the students and the teachers that you are responsible for. Let me begin, though, by offering you two examples of learning outcomes. I'm going to focus on Leni Dam's experience, and the examples I'm going to share with you are in that book. Some years ago now, towards the end of 4 years of learning English, where they had 3 lessons a week, 3 times 45 minutes, 2 of those blocked together to form an hour and a half, she said to her learners, how would you assess your overall progress as learners of English? Now, this wasn't a homework project. This was a question she asked them. She gave them each a sheet of paper, 5 minutes to think, then they wrote, and she collected the results. This is what one boy wrote, 15. Most important is probably the way we've worked, that we were expected to and given the chance to decide ourselves what to do, that we worked independently. And we've learned much more because we've worked with different things. In this way, we could help each other because some of us have learned something and others have learned something else. It doesn't mean we haven't had a teacher to help us, because we have and she has helped us. But the day she didn't have the time, we could manage on our own. Now, that's transcribed without correction from the original written by this 15-year-old boy. You can see that there are hints here and there that it's not written by a native speaker of English, but you can also see that there's an enviable level of coherence in the text, of control, and what this learner is doing precisely is exercising agency and expressing voice, focused in this case very much on himself as a learner, a member of a learning community. Here's what another learner wrote, this time a girl. I already make use of the fixed procedures from our diaries when trying to get something done at home. These are the learner logbooks I'm going to talk about in a minute. Then I make a list of what to do or remember the following day. That makes things much easier. I've also, via English, learned to start a conversation with a stranger and ask good questions. And I think that our Together session has helped me to become better at listening to other people and to be interested in them. I feel that I've learned to believe in myself and to be independent. I showed that text to my grown-up daughters who have children of their own, though not yet teenagers, and they all were quite sure that that had been written by a native speaker of English. But it wasn't. It was written by a 15-year-old girl in a Danish middle school in a mixed ability class. But again, what you can see is this exercise of agency and expression of voice. That example and the previous example seem to me to be irrefutable evidence of the fact that when these learners are at the business of learning English, they are doing something which is increasingly becoming part of their identity. So let me say a bit about the classroom where this happens. These are the basic beliefs or assumptions that the teacher operates on. First of all, clearly, the goal is to develop communicative proficiency. But the teacher knows that the means to do this is not by teaching grammar or giving vocabulary to be learned or whatever. It's not even task-based learning where the teacher designs the task. What happens in this classroom is based on the recognition that language learning is a matter actually of involving learners as active agents in the construction of a communicative community out of which proficiency gradually emerges. So the teacher knows that spontaneous use of the target language is vital, but it's not going to work unless it's authentic. And that means that it's got to be driven by the orientation, the interests, the private agendas, the developing collaborative agendas of the learners. Of course, she knows that she can't, although she's going to focus so much on target language use, abolish the learner's knowledge of their L1 or suppress its dominance between their ears. Because she knows that all their intuitions about language come from their L1, and she's got to depend on those intuitions being appropriately called into play in the classroom. She also knows, of course, that especially in the early stages, the web of concepts, which is going to be the basis for the construction of proficiency, is something learners have access to in their L1, and there's going to be a lot of translation. But she's absolutely convinced that there is this symbiotic relation between using the target language and developing proficiency. What does she do? Well, of course, she uses the target language with her learners from the beginning, with all kinds of mime and gesture to make sure they understand. But there's no principled way, according to any theory of language acquisition, that you can identify a point in learning where it becomes appropriate to switch to the target language. Of course, as I've just said, she translates L1 words, phrases, and so on request. That's essential, especially in the very early stages. She scaffolds learners' attempts to speak and write the target language. But in doing so, she tries to make sure that they develop an understanding of how to scaffold one another and, in due course, themselves. She requires learners to select and devise their own learning activities. She engages learners again from the beginning in metacognitive talk, evaluation. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it? What are the outcomes? How effective are they? So her role is to manage an ever-turning work cycle and to monitor the progress of individual learners, but also of the class as a learning community as a whole. The tools she uses are these. First of all, learner logbooks, the diaries that the second of my examples referred to. And learner logbooks are used to maintain a record, lesson by lesson, of learning. So learners write the content of each lesson, a little agenda of what they've done. They note down new words that have arisen. They write down words that they need to memorize. They write their plans for homework. Periodically, they evaluate their own progress. To begin with, in very simple terms. Especially in the early stages, logbooks are where they write the short texts they compose. And as far as possible, all this is done from the beginning in the target language, so that it's a rolling record of what's happening. That, of course, is an individual thing. Here are some examples from 3 logbooks. Beginning of the academic year, Monday the 7th of September, 1 September page, 2 say words cards, 3 picture lotto, 4 home word, make picture lotto. So this is this particular beginning learner's agenda of what was done in class and what he's going to do for homework. And he's written down 2 phrases, I can see and I have. And then Leni at some subsequent point has taken in the logbook, not to correct it, but to see what's going on and to write some encouraging words. Second example comes from halfway through the year, and the teacher has quite clear demands for what learners write in their logbooks and how they keep them. And she has reminded them of this and made them note them down. So we've got demands for diary, you've got to number the pages for cross-reference. You've got to have margins, there's got to be a month page. That's what the third example is, announcing the beginning of a new month. You write down new words, there must always be the date and day. Line jumping, which means between entries you leave a blank line. At the moment I'm reading, because learners in this environment are expected to be reading from an early stage. To begin with, very simple children's books, but they soon enough progress to Harry Potter in English. Homework must be clearly written, there must be nice handwriting, line order, day and date, easy to follow the day's work. And then you've got the August month page. The image is probably too small for you to read how delighted this child is to be coming into her last year of English, but to be reunited with the teacher and the class. In parallel with logbooks are posters. These are written on sheets of A3 paper and stuck to the classroom wall and retained for future reference for as long as they're relevant. And they're used to stimulate, guide and record the learning of the class. They're created in real time by the teacher interacting with the class as a whole. So they contain almost anything but words and phrases, ideas for learning activities and homework, results of brainstorming, teacher translating from the L1 of course, and in due course learners pick up on this and they use posters to guide their own work, project work. Here are 3 examples. One of the things that learners always need to know is what is expected of them. So at the beginning of each year, one of the teacher's tasks is to present to the learners in terms that are appropriate to their level of proficiency in English and their maturity, what the official demands of them are. So Leni's interpretation of this is that as far as language is concerned, they're meant to aim for fluency, a varied vocabulary, good intonation, correctness, communicative competence, and competence in writing. They're also meant to deal with different text types, other English-speaking countries, and media other than print. Second example, the kind of things that they might undertake for homework. Make a story, read a book, make word cards, make my own dictionary, find something English. And the third example is a poster written by the teacher in interaction with the class when they've been learning English for about 6 weeks, inviting them to call out in their L1 what they thought were good ways of learning English, and she immediately wrote up the equivalent in English which they could write down in their logbooks. So watching films and television, reading, listening to English and so on and so forth. Nothing very startling there, but then 11-year-old learners can't be expected to come up with something none of us has thought of. The important thing is that they're thinking about these things and their potential effectiveness. Within the framework created by logbooks and posters, which guarantees that communication in the target language is communicative but also metacognitive and often difficult to distinguish between the two, They engage in two kinds of activities. They create their own learning materials. To begin with, they create these word cards, little cards, and they write the words that they think they would like to know, because they're important to them in some sense or other. And on the reverse, they draw a picture or write an L1 equivalent or whatever. And then they go on to dominoes, where each domino card has a picture cut out from a magazine or whatever on one half, and on the other half a little text that refers to a picture on another card. And from there they go on to Picture Lotto, which I won't try to describe to you, but I'll be glad to do in private for anyone who asks afterwards. And then they get on to the collaborative development of board games. And in all of these things, there's an enormous amount of learning going on in creating these materials, in using and playing with them in various ways, and of course in sharing them with the rest of the class. There is a gradually developing resource within the class. And what these learners put into these materials is of course always relevant to them, part of themselves. A couple of examples. If you are a fan of textbooks that are based on word frequency, one of the things about giving learners charge of the learning of vocabulary is that they won't pick the most frequent words to learn, because the most frequent words tend not to capture what's distinctive about me or you. You might just about get ship, but scissors, I doubt it. This same learner had axe and machine gun in his cards. I don't know what became of him. And Rosette. You won't find Rosette, but Rosette is important to this learner because she was a fanatical member of the Pony Club and had just won one. Or the bottom of the screen, you've got the picture dominoes created in his second year of English by Dennis, who was a nightmarish student, but who, as you can see, nevertheless managed to knuckle under. Not long after this, he was expelled from school for persistent bad behavior and bullying and all the rest. But in his English class, because it was handed over to him and he was expected to, he was able to do that. Here's a board game. This was created over several homework sessions by one girl who had some help from her mother. It's a game, as you can see, for 3 players, Elizabeth, Nancy and Mary, and the rules are you're 3 women who want to eat dinner with the same man. The man is very rich and looks good. If you win, you're going to have dinner with him. But, it's not so easy. On the way to the restaurant, you're going to do something. Every time you stop on a question mark, you have to take a card. And the cards are things like, though of course my English isn't the learner's English, it starts to rain and your mascara runs, you have to go and mend it. And things like that. Now that was done by a girl in her second year of English. But you can see the engagement there that is expressive of agency and voice. All of these games work. We have a great collection of them, and from time to time we have to be fairly drunk to do it, but we can make them work. This is my favourite. This was done by learners in their 4th year, and it was a project that ran over a number of weeks because they had lots and lots of cards to devise. You can see from the layout of the board the influence of Trivial Pursuit. And the capital letters refer to different topics, and then there would be a number of cards with general knowledge questions on these different topics. H was history, S was sport, can't remember what L was. MQ was mixed questions, G geography, e-English, and so on. And then, beside the development of these learner-created learning materials, you have learner-generated texts. The first homework that kids do in this environment is write a text about myself. The teacher gives them a text frame on a poster. My name is, I live, my hobbies are. They then call out in Danish the things they need to be able to say to complete the frame. And she writes up again on a series of posters the English equivalents. And of course, the whole class can write in their logbooks not only the words they need, but the words others are going to need. And from there they go to picture plus text. Cut a picture out of a magazine and then write a little text about the picture. Boys of 11 and 12 always cut out pictures of women aged about 18 or 20, and you'll see an example or two in a moment, write wish fulfillment texts about them. But sooner rather than later they get into collaborative work, writing plays and stories and poems, and really quite elaborate projects. Here are two of those first homework texts. So this is the first day of learning English. My name is Thomas, I'm 10 years old. I'm a member of the BB, that's the Boys Brigade. My grandfather and grandmother have a motorboat. That was obviously the big thing for him during the summer. And on the right, my name is Lena Christensen, I'm 10 years old. I am a member of the GB, that's the Girls Brigade. My mother's name is Kate, my father's name is Stain. I have 4 hens. My birthday is on the 13th of February. Here are a photo of me. And then, you can see these were written on the same day, 26th of August, beginning of the school year again. It's Anya's birthday. And the second text says it's Anya's birthday, happy birthday. And then on the left you've got Jeanette. My name is Jeanette, I live in Denmark. I'm 20 years old, I am a model, I have a sister, her name is Camilla, she's 15 years old. I like clothes, cats, to swim, to gym, and to surf. And my cat Bella, and horses. I don't have a boyfriend because I travel so much. Or on the right, my name is Sarah, I live in England. I'm 21 years old, and I have a boyfriend, his name is Brandon. My hobbies is horses, swimming, football. I could, of course, have spent the rest of the day regaling you with these examples and gradually moving to the point where learners are able to write the kind of texts that I began with. But life is short. Let me just point out that in this approach to learning and teaching, there is a dual focus that is constantly interacting. There's a focus on intentional learning, activities that are analytic, that focus on language and linguistic form. That's the word cards and the picture domino and the board games. And they can be very simple, like these word cards, but they can also be sophisticated. Hannah Thompson had a class who, in their 4th year of English, decided it would be a good way of spending much of the term for them all to get the latest Harry Potter novel. And it was in the series when they were beginning to suffer a bit from obesity, so they were really fat books. But they read these in English and then formed teams in order to create a sort of Harry Potter glossary and encyclopedia. Hannah wrote about that in a book I edited back in 2003. And on the other side, we have creative text production, activities that gradually become more complex and ambitious from a very simple start, usually involve working in pairs or small groups, and give language learning always a here and now focus. And it's this here and now focus, it's relevant to me, I want to be doing this because I'm in charge, I've been asked to express my interests, and so on and so forth. And there are 3 points that I think it's important to note. First of all, because everything is communicated in the target language, the boundaries between intentional learning and creative text production are fuzzy. Traditional distinctions between listening and speaking, reading and writing are difficult to maintain. But the dynamic of the classroom depends on writing in order to speak and speaking in order to write. Especially in the early stages, the use of the technology of literature, the capacity to write things down, to make notes, is crucially important in supporting communication in the target language between learners, because it frees up processing space in here that they can concentrate on the things that at that stage are most difficult, like coming up with the words in a reasonably authentic sounding or comprehensible translation. But turning it on its head, when learners work collaboratively, their interactive talk is what creates the basis for discursive written text. Learners in this environment are exercising, learning, developing, growing in 3 interacting roles. They are, of course, communicators, because they're using, and by using, gradually developing communicative skills in their target language. But they're also experimenters with language, gradually developing an explicit knowledge of the target language system. And they're intentional learners. This focus the whole time on evaluative talk, metacognition, and so on, gradually developing an explicit awareness of language learning. And of course, those 3 roles are mutually supporting and constantly interacting. What about the questions on the basis of all of that for university language centres? In the learning environment I've described, learners accept responsibility for their learning, set their own learning targets within the framework provided by the curriculum, choose and create learning materials and activities, and evaluate learning outcomes. They do these things in their target language as committed members of the language learning community to which they belong. And because the learning and teaching dynamic is grounded in target language use, autonomous language learning and autonomous language use are inseparable, 2 sides of the same coin. Learners develop agency by exercising agency. They develop voice by using voice. So, to what extent are your language courses delivered using the kind of teaching and learning dynamic I've described? How do you ensure that your students accept overall responsibility for their learning? To what extent are they able to set their own learning targets and choose their own learning materials and activities? Do your students regularly evaluate their own learning outcomes? If yes, how does this happen? And what's the relation between self-assessment, peer assessment, and formal tests and exams? If the answer to the question is no, why not? What evidence do you have that your students do indeed develop agency and voice in their second language? The learning environment I've described exploits in a very deliberate way the dialogic nature of language. Consider, language evolved out of collaborative interaction, and children acquire it thanks to an interactive instinct. Language helps to shape our consciousness dialogically. According to George Herbert Mead, consciousness entails becoming other to oneself. For Bakhtin, consciousness is knowing with others. Language helps to shape cognition dialogically. Individual cognition is necessarily impregnated with partially shared language norms, knowledge, and conceptual systems. When we engage in reflective thinking, internal voices are invoked and interpenetrate. In the way you teach your language courses, what kinds of discourse initiative are available to your students? And how exactly do they take them? What role does collaborative learning play in your language courses? How do you ensure that students collaborate in their target language? To what extent do your language courses exploit the digital communication channels that most students use in their daily lives? If collaborative learning plays a significant role in your language courses, how do you take account of it in exams and other forms of assessment? The learning environment I've described grounds language learning in the learner's identity. Our subjective identities, our self-concepts, are partly shaped by the language or languages in which we tell ourselves stories about ourselves. Jerome Bruner's notion that he worked on from the 1980s onwards of narrative cognition. Our subjective identities are dialogic in the sense that we develop experience and revise them in relation to the people with whom we interact, family, friends, colleagues, strangers. As Maturana and Varela say in one of the great books, we work out our lives in a mutual linguistic coupling, not because language permits us to reveal ourselves, but because we're constituted in language in a continuous becoming that we bring forth with others. How do you ensure that your language courses fully engage each student's subjectivity? In what ways are your teaching and learning dynamic and the activities you require your students to perform calculated to draw the target language into their identity? To what extent and for what purposes do your language courses promote target language use outside the immediate context of learning? In the learning environment I've described, writing fulfills 5 interacting functions. A function of self-management, because without writing things down, it's impossible to plan one's learning. A function of documentation, which in any case is a sine qua non of self-management, was also valuable for its own sake, to have this detailed chronological record of what one has done, what one's attempted, what one shared with others, what one's learned, and so on and so forth. A function of narrative. If learning is effectively documented, the written text becomes a potential narrative, autobiography of learning. And if learner self-assessment is focused the whole time on this cumulative record of what has been learned and taught, then they do begin to tell themselves stories about themselves in their target language. Again, Bruner's notion of narrative cognition. A function of reflection, because a written record of learning and its outcomes is a precondition for what Bruner, coming at things from a slightly different angle, talks of as reflective intervention in the process and content of learning. And finally, a function of construction, because by using this technology of literature, literacy, making marks on paper, learners literally construct the target language as they construct texts. They construct their proficiency. In that learning environment I've described, therefore, learners are continuously engaged in activities that require them to exploit the technology of literacy. As process, continuous writing ensures a focus on linguistic form. David Olson's notion that writing is metalinguistics. The continuous production of written text also generates written products that are learning outcomes. This use of writing is always embedded in oral interaction, the teacher with the whole class, the teacher with groups of learners, learners with learners, and the teacher with individual learners. Especially in the early stages, as I pointed out earlier, writing supports speaking, and spoken interaction generates written text. Do your language courses engage your students in writing activities that serve the 5 functions I've described: self-management, documentation, narrative, reflection, and construction? Do your language courses exploit the interdependence of oral and written communication in the way that I've described? If yes, how exactly do you use the oral channel to support the development of writing and the written channel to support oral communication? To what extent do your assessment procedures reflect this interdependence of speaking and writing? You can probably sense that I could go on and on and on, but I won't. It's time to start to finish. I began by suggesting that at all levels, second language education is characterized by a serious mismatch between goals and aspirations on the one side and outcomes on the other, and I linked that to the problem of establishing learner agency and voice as a core part of language learning and teaching. And I suggested also that the situation is due, at least in large part, to a widespread failure to question traditional teaching and learning dynamics. Approaches based on the concept of learner autonomy, as I understand it, ground second language learning in second language use that's spontaneous, authentic, and partly led by the learners, agency and voice again. It requires learners to take responsibility for their learning and document the learning process and its outcomes. These approaches frame teaching and learning in a recursive dynamic of planning, implementation, and evaluation. They use writing to support speaking and speaking to generate written text. And in these ways, they ensure that learners' L2 proficiency is part of their developing identity and extends their capacity for agentive behavior and critical thinking. The environment that I've described in every respect coincides with the so-called social turn in theories of second language acquisition. For example, complexity theory, Neo-Vygotsky sociocultural theory, the socio-cognitive approach, and ecological approaches. And yet, on the whole, those theories fail to challenge pedagogical tradition. If you read the stuff that comes out of Penn State University under the Neo-Vygotskian label, when they talk about classrooms, it's the most old-fashioned, impossible stuff you can imagine. And yet it's meant to illuminate or be illuminated by Vygotskian theory. One noble exception to that generalization is, however, my friend, the late Leo van Leer, who was always engaged with learning context before he worried about theory and research. The environment I described is an instance of exploratory practice, as Dick Albright defined that back in 2003. And this is where research comes into the picture very, very briefly right at the end. Exploratory practice might be thought of as a form of action research, but it's a way of going about things in which learners are fully involved as contributors to what is necessarily a social investigative enterprise. If you are running your language learning environment or environments in an age-appropriate version of the kind of thing I described to you in the second part of my talk, you don't need to elicit research data. You have research data more than you will ever be able to handle, constantly churning out, because that is the nature of the kind of process you're managing. All you've got to do is find interesting things to think and say about it write them down, and get them published. And so, by creating such a learning environment, it seems to me at any rate that CercleS members can help their students to develop agency and voice in their target language or languages, and a capacity for creative and critical thinking. If you found ways of doing it that are as convincing as the examples I began the second part of my talk with, without doing the kind of thing I've talked about, I'd be very interested to hear about it. CercleS members can also investigate language learning in innovative ways that are fully integrated with their teaching. That's the exploratory practice point again. And by doing that, make a distinctive research contribution that obliges universities to acknowledge that language centres are a great deal more than service units. One of the most sadly revealing things about language centres came to me early in my involvement with CercleS, when I was a member of what preceded AULC, the Directors of University Language Centres, who from time to time used to send around questionnaires. And although the questionnaires were mostly driven by the peculiarities of the UK system, I did my best to respond to them and to contribute to the pooling of information. I responded to one particularly elaborate questionnaire, spending several hours doing so. When the report was circulated, I found, to my wry amazement, that my response had been dismissed and not considered because it was felt that research fell outside the normal range of language centres' activities. Well, well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I think coffee is now served.
Thank you very much, David, for this very enlightening talk, as always. Thank you.
He's certainly given me lots of things to think about. Am I already doing that? It made me think about also how our learners come to us, how many of them are the critical thinkers, how many of them are already able to learn by themselves. This is very much often, at least in Italy, the problem, the relationship between schooling and then university, of how, and I often find very much people coming and not knowing why they are studying languages. And so motivation is not there to start off with, and then everything crumbles. But the main thing here, yes, is giving our learners a voice, and then we can learn from them to know how to help them in the future. I'm not certain we have time for questions. We're running late. The coffee is served, that you can go and get a cup. Has anybody got a question, a very quick question that they would like to ask?
Yes. Maybe I can stand up
And yell.
I'm from the University of Lorraine in France, and we have a program, a very small scheme in which we try to develop learners' autonomy. But I thought it was very interesting argument. But the problem is that isn't there a difference between children who start from the beginning being in an environment where they are left to develop as autonomous learners, and students who come after years of traditional teaching, and where you have to sort of deconstruct what they have in their head as what it is to learn a language. I think one of the problems we have is that students have representations
and that you need to help them deconstruct these representations in a way. So what could be interesting is how you could help those learners destroy these misrepresentations they have about learning and language.
I think there are two. Is this working? Yes. I think there are two parts to an answer to that question. The first part is a bit of a response to what Gillian said. In 1986, I was appointed to something called the Board of Study for Languages in the Curriculum. This was some new initiative in Ireland. And we began the first meeting with a tour de table. And the first person to speak was the Professor of French at University College Dublin, because he was the most senior person. And he said, well, it's very difficult for us to achieve any sensible educational outcomes because of the material we receive from the schools. And then the headmaster of one of our largest comprehensive schools said, I understand what the professor's saying, but he must understand that for us it's also very difficult because we have to deal with the material we get from primary schools. And the very old nun who was representing the Primary Principals Association said, yes, and I blame the parents. So the point about that is that at any stage of education, people come with experience, they come with representations and all the rest of it. And of course, we've got to work with it. If I'd chosen a different tack for the talk, I could have illustrated it by offering a version of exactly the same general approach, which we adopted very successfully over 8 or 10 years in the work we did teaching intensive English language programs for refugees admitted to Dublin, or to Ireland rather. And these people had their preconceptions. We had one refugee from Moldova who was really very aggressive towards his teacher because he knew that the only way that he could learn English was by being given grammatical paradigms to learn, memorize. It took 3 weeks before he was borrowing from our library a book to read so that he could contribute to this process. And I'm happy to say the title of the book he chose was The Rats of Stalingrad, which was a Second World War event. Now, I understand what you're saying, and I've been there myself, because I'm not without teaching experience over many years. I think that we have to be prepared to think in very radical ways. But I'm sure you agree with that. I hope you agree.
I think we ought to stop as we're running a little late and you need to get your coffees.